In the shadows of Chicago's Robert Taylor homes, a baby named Jeremiah lay forgotten, his cries fading into the silence of a mother's despair. Born into neglect, his tiny heart beat with a strength no one could have predicted. Taken in by a preacher and his wife, Jeremiah grew up carrying the weight of questions about the mother who left him. From the gritty streets of Englewood to the halls of Morehouse College, he fought to rise above his past, his fire fueled by love, faith, and an unyielding will. When he finally finds his mother Lottie in a rundown shelter, their reunion is both a wound and a healing. This is a story of resilience, of a boy who turned pain into purpose, building a legacy that echoes through the lives he touches. Can a child abandoned at birth become a beacon of hope for others? Dive into the surprising outcome of a neglected black baby, a story of resilience to witness a journey that will break your heart and mend it anew.
The silent beginning. The air hung heavy with the scent of stale cigarettes and unwashed dreams in the cramped apartment on the south side of Chicago. It was 1972, and the city pulsed with the rhythm of survival, its heartbeat echoing through the cracked pavement of the Robert Taylor homes. In a corner of a one-bedroom unit, a baby lay in a sagging crib, his tiny chest rising and falling with breaths that seemed frail for the world he'd been born into. His name was Jeremiah, though no one had spoken it in days. The room was dim, lit only by a single bulb flickering like a tired promise, casting shadows over the peeling wallpaper. Jeremiah's mother, Loretta, was 22, her youth already eroded by the weight of choices she hadn't meant to make. She sat on a threadbare couch, her eyes fixed on a black and white television that buzzed with static more than sound. A bottle of cheap gin rested on the coffee table, its contents dwindling as the hours blurred into one another. She wasn't a bad woman, not in the way people might think. Life had simply pressed down on her, layer upon layer, until she couldn't see past the fog of her own despair. Her boyfriend, Clarence, had left 3 months ago, promising to come back with money for the rent. He hadn't. The bills piled up, and the world outside the window seemed to mock her with its indifference. Jeremiah's cries had started as sharp, insistent demands, but they'd weakened over the days. As if he, too, understood the futility of calling out. Loretta would feed him when she remembered, her hands trembling as she mixed powdered formula with tap water. Sometimes, she'd hold him, her tears falling onto his soft, dark curls, whispering apologies he couldn't yet understand. "I'm trying, baby," she'd say, her voice cracking. "I'm trying." But trying wasn't enough, and the neighbors had begun to notice. Miss Evelyn, the widowed seamstress who lived across the hall, had seen too much in her 56 years to stay silent. Her own children were grown, scattered across the city like seeds on rocky soil, but she remembered the weight of a baby in her arms, the way their needs anchored you to the world. She'd heard Jeremiah's cries through the thin walls, faint at first, then fading into something more dribling, a silence that spoke of neglect. One evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, she knocked on Loretta's door, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and resolve. "Loretta, you in there?" Miss Evelyn's voice was firm but kind, honed by years of raising children and mending broken things. There was no answer, only the faint hum of the television. She knocked again, harder this time, her knuckles rapping against the chipped wood. "Loretta, open this door, girl. I know you hear me." Inside, Loretta stirred, her head heavy with gin and guilt. She stumbled to the door, her eyes bloodshot, her hair a tangled halo. "What'd you want, Miss Evelyn?" she mumbled, leaning against the frame. Miss Evelyn's gaze softened but didn't waver. "I want to see that baby. Ain't heard him in a while, and that ain't right." She pushed past Loretta, her steps purposeful, her faded housecoat swishing against her legs. The apartment smelled of neglect's sour milk, unwashed dishes, and something deeper, like hope left to rot. She found Jeremiah in his crib, his tiny body curled into itself, his lips dry and cracked. His eyes, wide and dark, met hers, and in them, she saw a spark that hadn't yet been extinguished. "Lord have mercy," Miss Evelyn whispered, scooping him up. His weight was too light, his skin cool against her warmth. She turned to Loretta, who stood frozen in the doorway, tears streaming down her face. "This child needs more than you giving him, Loretta." "I'm trying," Loretta sobbed, her voice breaking. "I don't know how to do this alone." Miss Evelyn's heart ached, but her resolve was iron. "You ain't alone no more. We gotta figure this out. But this baby can't wait." She wrapped Jeremiah in a blanket, her hands steady despite the tremor in her chest. That night, she took him to her own apartment, feeding him warm milk and rocking him until his cries softened into sleep. She didn't know it then, but that act of courage would set Jeremiah on a path no one could have predicted. The next morning, Miss Evelyn called her cousin, Reverend Thomas, who ran a small church on the west side. He was a man of quiet strength, his voice a balm to the weary souls who filled his pews each Sunday. At 48, he'd seen the city chew up dreams and spit out broken lives, but he believed in second chances, in the way grace could find you in the darkest corners. When Miss Evelyn told him about Jeremiah, he didn't hesitate. "Bring him to me," he said. "We'll find a way." Reverend Thomas and his wife Clara had no children of their own, a sorrow they carried with quiet dignity. Their home was modest, filled with the warmth of shared meals and the echo of gospel hymns. When Miss Evelyn arrived with Jeremiah, Clara's eyes filled with tears. She took the baby in her arms, her hands gentle but sure, as if she'd been waiting for him all her life. "He's ours now," she whispered to her husband, and Reverend Thomas nodded, his heart swelling with a purpose he hadn't felt in years. They named him Jeremiah Isaiah Thomas, the middle name a nod to the prophet who spoke of hope in the midst of exile. The paperwork was handled quietly, with Miss Evelyn's help and a social worker who knew the system too well to ask too many questions. Loretta, broken but relieved, signed the papers, her hands shaking as she gave her son a chance at a life she couldn't provide. She disappeared soon after, leaving only whispers of her name in the neighborhood. Jeremiah grew in the Thomas household, surrounded by love that was both fierce and tender. Clara taught him to read by the time he was 4, her voice patient as she sounded out words from old hymns. Reverend Thomas told him stories of black heroes Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Malcolm X, instilling a pride that would anchor him through the years. But even in their care, the shadow of neglect lingered, a quiet wound in Jeremiah's heart. He didn't know his mother's face, only the stories Miss Evelyn shared, stories of a woman who loved him but couldn't hold him. By the time Jeremiah was 10, he was a quiet boy with eyes that saw too much. He excelled in school, his mind sharp and hungry, but there was a restlessness in him, a need to understand where he came from. The Robert Taylor homes were still standing, though they were crumbling, a monument to dreams deferred. One day, he slipped away from home, his sneakers pounding the pavement, as he made his way to the place where his life had begun. The apartment was empty now, the walls stripped bare, but standing in the doorway, he felt the weight of his mother's absence, the echo of her apologies. He didn't cry, not then. Instead, he turned back to the street, his small frame silhouetted against the fading light. Something stirred in him, a resolve, a spark of resilience that would carry him through the years to come. He didn't know it yet, but that moment would shape him, a boy born into neglect, but destined for something greater. The weight of roots, the streets of Chicago in 1982 were a maze of contradictions, where hope and despair walked hand in hand. Jeremiah, now 10, navigated them with a quiet intensity, his eyes always searching for something he couldn't name. The Thomas household was his sanctuary, but the world beyond its walls was a puzzle he was determined to solve. Reverend Thomas and Clara had given him a foundation la faith, and a sense of purpose, but the ghost of his early days lingered, a faint ache that surfaced in the quiet moments. School was where Jeremiah at Douglas Elementary. He was the boy who always had his hand up, his answers sharp and thoughtful. His teacher, Mrs. Henderson, a woman in her late 40s with a voice like warm molasses, saw something in Jaime Spark that reminded her of her own brother, lost to the streets years ago. She'd stay late to help him with his math, her glasses slipping down her nose as she explained fractions, with the patience of a saint. "You got a mind like a steel trap, Jeremiah," she'd say, her smile wide. "Don't let nobody tell you different." But the streets had their own lessons, ones that didn't come with textbooks. The Robert Taylor homes, those still standing, were a battleground of dreams and desperation. Gangs roamed the courtyards, their laughter sharp and dangerous, and Jeremiah learned early to keep his head down and his steps quick. Yet he was drawn to the stories of the people around him, the old men playing chess on milk crates, the women braiding hair on stoops, their voices weaving tales of survival. He listened, soaking in their words like a sponge, piecing together a history that felt like his own. One afternoon, as he walked home from school, a boy named Marcus cornered him near the corner store. Marcus was 13, tall and wiry, with a swagger that came from running with the older boys. "What are you doing out here, church boy?" he taunted, his friend snickering behind him. "Think you better than us 'cause you got a preacher daddy." Jeremiah's heart pounded, but he stood his ground, his fists clenched at his sides. "Ain't thinking nothing," he said, his voice steady despite the fear curling in his stomach. "Just trying to get home." Marcus laughed, stepping closer, his breath hot with the scent of candy and bravado. "You soft, Jeremiah. Soft like that mama of yours who left you." The words hit like a fist, and for a moment, Jeremiah's vision blurred. He didn't know much about Loretta, only the fragments Miss Evelyn had shared, but the mention of her stung, a reminder of the hole she'd left. He didn't swing, though his hands itched too. Instead, he met Marcus's gaze, his dark eyes unyielding. "You don't know nothing about my mama," he said, his voice low but firm, "and you don't know me." Something in his tone made Marcus pause, and the older boy stepped back, muttering under his breath before turning away with his crew. That night, Jeremiah sat at the kitchen table, his homework untouched. Clara noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his pencil tapped restlessly against the page. She set a plate of cornbread and collards in front of him, her hands lingering on his shoulders. "What's eating at you, baby?" she asked, her voice soft but probing. He didn't answer at first, his eyes fixed on the steam rising from the greens. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why'd she leave me? Mama Clara, my real mama. Was I not enough?" Clara's breath caught, and she knelt beside him, her hands cupping his face. Her eyes, warm and deep, held a sorrow that mirrored his own. "Oh, Jeremiah," she said, her voice trembling. "It ain't about you being enough. Loretta," she was lost in her own pain. "She loved you, but she couldn't carry herself, let alone you. That don't mean you ain't worthy of love. You hear me?" He nodded, but the words didn't erase the ache. Clara pulled him into her arms, and he let her hold him, his tears soaking into her apron. Reverend Thomas, watching from the doorway, felt his heart twist. He'd seen too many children carry the weight of their parents' choices, but Jeremiah's strength, even at 10, was something rare. He joined them at the table, his voice steady as he spoke. "Son, you got a purpose bigger than the pain you carry. God don't make mistakes, and he put you here for a reason." Those words stayed with Jeremiah, a seed planted in fertile ground. He threw himself into his studies, determined to prove his worth, not just to himself but to the world that had tried to discard him. By the time he was 16, he was at the top of his class at Dunbar High School, his name a quiet legend among teachers who saw his potential. But the streets were still there, whispering temptations, and Marcus, now a foot soldier in a local gang, hadn't forgotten him. One evening, as Jeremiah walked home from a late study session, Marcus and his crew blocked his path. The air was thick with the promise of trouble, the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. "Still think you special, church boy?" Marcus sneered, a switchblade glinting in his hand. "Time you learned how things work round here." Jeremiah's pulse raced, but he remembered Reverend Thomas's words, the way they'd anchored him through the years. He straightened, his voice calm but firm. "I ain't looking for trouble, Marcus, but I ain't running neither." The standoff might have ended in blood if not for Miss Evelyn, who appeared like a guardian angel, her voice cutting through the tension. "Marcus Jackson, you put that knife away for I call your mama and the police both," she snapped, her presence a force of nature. The boys scattered, and Miss Evelyn walked Jeremiah home, her hand firm on his shoulder. "You got too much to lose, boy," she said. "Don't let them pull you down." That moment was a turning point. Jeremiah began to see the streets not just as a threat but as a challenge, a place where he could make a difference. He started volunteering at Reverend Thomas's church, helping with the youth group, sharing his story with kids who reminded him of himself. His words, simple but raw, carried weight, and the younger ones listened, their eyes wide with the possibility of something more. By 18, Jeremiah had earned a full scholarship to Morehouse College, a dream that felt like a miracle in a neighborhood where dreams often died young. The night before he left, Clara cooked his favorite meal: fried chicken, macaroni and cheese, and peach cobbler, and the three of them sat around the table, their laughter mingling with tears. "You carry us with you," Jeremiah Reverend Thomas said, his voice thick with pride. "And you carry your mama, too, even if she ain't here." As Jeremiah boarded the bus to Atlanta, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder, he felt the weight of his roots, not just the pain of his beginning, but the love that had lifted him. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he knew he was ready. A boy forged in adversity, his heart beating with resilience. The fire within Atlanta in 1990 was a city on the cusp of transformation, its skyline, a mix of old brick and new ambition. Morehouse College stood as a beacon for young black men like Jeremiah, a place where history and possibility collided. At 18, he stepped onto the campus with a mix of awe and determination, his heart pounding with the weight of the journey that had brought him here. The air was warm, thick with the scent of magnolias, and the promise of something bigger than himself. Jeremiah's scholarship covered tuition, but life at Morehouse wasn't easy. He worked nights at a campus library, shelving books while his classmates slept, his hands calloused but his mind sharp. His dorm room was small, shared with a roommate from Detroit named Malik, whose quick wit and love for jazz made the long nights bearable. Malik was the first to notice Jeremiah's quiet intensity, the way his eyes seemed to carry stories he didn't share. "Man, you got a fire in you," Malik said one night, passing him a cup of instant coffee. "What's it burning for?" Jeremiah didn't answer right away, his gaze fixed on the steam rising from the mug. "Something bigger than me," he finally said, his voice low but sure. "Something that makes all this mean something." Malik nodded, recognizing the weight of a purpose unspoken. His classes were a revelation. Professors like Dr. Carter, a grizzled historian with a voice that could shake the walls, taught him about the resilience of their people, men and women who'd built lives from the ashes of oppression. Jeremiah soaked it in, his notebooks filled with quotes from Du Bois and King, his mind alight with the idea that he could be part of that legacy. But the weight of his past never left him. Late at night, when the campus was quiet, he'd lie awake, wondering about Loretta, about the mother who'd given him life, but couldn't keep him. The questions gnawed at him, a quiet ache that fueled his drive. In his sophomore year, Jeremiah joined the debate team, his voice finding strength in the rhythm of argument. He spoke with a clarity that silenced rooms, his words rooted in the pain and pride of his Chicago upbringing. At a regional competition, he faced off against a team from a wealthier school. There captained a polished young man named Ethan, who dismissed Jeremiah with a smirk. "You're good, but you're out of your league," Ethan said before the match, his tone dripping with condescension. Jeremiah didn't flinch. When his turn came, he stood tall, his voice steady as he dismantled Ethan's arguments with facts and fire. "You talk about opportunity like it's a gift you hand out," he said, his eyes locked on Ethan's. "But some of us had to claw our way here, and we ain't apologizing for it." The room erupted in applause, and Dr. Carter, watching from the back, gave him a nod that felt like a crown. That victory was a turning point, but it wasn't without cost. The more Jeremiah excelled, the more he felt the pull of his roots, the questions about his mother that no one could answer. He wrote letters to Miss Evelyn, asking if she'd heard anything about Loretta, but the replies were always the same. "She's gone, baby. Ain't nobody seen her in years." The uncertainty was a wound that wouldn't heal, and it drove him to seek answers in the only way he knew how, through action. In his junior year, Jeremiah started volunteering at a community center in Atlanta's West End, a neighborhood that reminded him of the Robert Taylor homes. The kids there were like he'd been hungry for something more, but trapped by circumstances they didn't choose. He taught them to read, shared stories of black heroes, and listened to their dreams, his heart breaking and mending with every conversation. One boy, a 10-year-old named Jamal, clung to him, his eyes wide with the same spark Jeremiah had once carried. "You think I can be somebody, Mr. J?" Jamal asked one day, his voice small but hopeful. Jeremiah knelt beside him, his hand firm on the boy's shoulder. "You already are, Jamal. You just gotta keep going." The words were as much for himself as for the boy, a reminder of the resilience that had carried him this far. But resilience wasn't armor. During his senior year, Jeremiah faced a crisis that tested everything he'd built. Malik, his roommate and closest friend, was arrested during a protest against police brutality, a cause that had been brewing on campus for months. The images of Malik being dragged away, his face bruised but defiant, burned into Jeremiah's mind. He joined the protests, his voice rising with others, but the weight of it, all the injustice. The memories of Marcus and the streets, the ghost of his mother threatened to break him. One night, alone in his dorm, Jeremiah sat at his desk. A letter from Clara opened in front of him. Her words were a lifeline. "You carry the strength of those who came before you. Don't let the world make you forget it." He traced the letters with his finger, his tears blurring the ink. He thought of Reverend Thomas's sermons, of Miss Evelyn's courage, of the kids at the community center who looked to him for hope. And he thought of Loretta, a woman he didn't know but whose absence had shaped him. The next day, Jeremiah organized a campus rally, his voice raw but unyielding as he spoke to a crowd of students, faculty, and community members. "We ain't just fighting for Malik," he said, his words carrying over the quad. "We fightin' for every one of us who's been told we don't belong, who's been left behind. We fightin' for our right to be." The crowd roared, and in that moment Jeremiah felt the fire Malik had seen in him, burning brighter than ever. By graduation, Jeremiah had become a leader, his name whispered with respect among his peers. He graduated with honors, his degree in history, a testament to his hunger for knowledge and his commitment to his people. But as he stood in his cap and gown, Clara and Reverend Thomas beaming from the audience, he knew his journey wasn't over. The questions about Loretta still lingered, a thread he couldn't let go. That summer, he made a decision. He would return to Chicago, not just to visit, but to find answers. He didn't know what he'd discovered, but he knew he couldn't move forward without facing the past. As he boarded the bus back home, his diploma tucked in his bag, he felt the weight of his roots and the fire within. A young man, shaped by neglect, but driven by resilience. The search for truth. Chicago welcomed Jeremiah back in the summer of 1994 with the familiar hum of its streets, a symphony of car horns, laughter, and the distant wail of sirens. At 22, he was no longer the boy who'd slipped away to the Robert Taylor homes to glimpse his past. He was a man now, his frame taller, his shoulders broad from carrying the weight of his ambitions. Yet, as the bus rolled into the Greyhound station, the city felt both like home and a stranger, its pulse stirring memories he'd tried to outrun. Reverend Thomas and Clara were waiting for him, their faces lit with pride and a touch of worry. Clara enveloped him in a hug, her arms still strong despite the gray creeping into her hair. "You look like a scholar, baby," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Reverend Thomas clapped him on the back, his eyes shining. "You done made us proud, son. Now what's this talk about staying here?" Jeremiah had told him his plan in a letter, though he'd kept the details vague. He wanted to stay in Chicago, to work with the community, to give back what he'd been given. But beneath that purpose was another, unspoken one. To find Loretta, or at least to understand why she'd left him. The questions had grown heavier with time, a shadow that followed him, even through the triumphs of more. He needed answers, not just for himself, but for the man he was becoming. He moved into a small apartment not far from Reverend Thomas's church, a modest place with creaking floors and a view of the L tracks. He found work at a community center in Englewood, a neighborhood where hope was hard-won but fiercely guarded. The center was a lifeline for kids like Jamal, the boy he'd mentored in Atlanta, and Jeremiah threw himself into the work, teaching classes, organizing after-school programs, and listening to stories that echoed his own. The kids called him Mr. J, their eyes bright with trust, and he felt a responsibility that both grounded and terrified him. But the search for Loretta was never far from his mind. He started with Miss Evelyn, who was now 68, her hands still quick with a needle but slower with age. She welcomed him with a plate of cornbread and a smile that held a lifetime of knowing. "You looking for her, ain't you?" she said, her eyes sharp despite the lines etched around them. "I told you all I know, Jeremiah. Loretta was a ghost after she gave you up. But if you gotta look, start with the old spots bars, shelters, the places folks go when they're lost." Her words were a map, vague but enough to begin. Jeremiah spent his evenings after work combing the city, his footsteps tracing a Chicago that had changed yet stayed the same. He visited dive bars where the air was thick with smoke and regret, shelters where tired faces told stories of survival, and churches where the weary sought solace. He carried a faded photo Miss Evelyn had given him, a grainy snapshot of Loretta at 19, her smile bright but her eyes heavy with something unspoken. He showed it to bartenders, social workers, and street vendors, asking if they'd seen her. But the answers were always the same. A shake of the head, a shrug, a murmured sorry man. The search took its toll. Some nights, Jeremiah sat in his apartment, the photo in his hands, his heart heavy with the weight of not knowing. He wondered if Loretta was still alive, if she'd found peace, or if she'd simply vanished into the city's underbelly. The uncertainty was a wound that reopened with every dead end, but it also fueled his resolve. He wasn't just looking for his mother. He was looking for the part of himself she'd left behind. One evening, as autumn painted the city in shades of gold and gray, Jeremiah found himself at a shelter on the west side, a place called Hope House. The director, a woman named Sister Mary, was in her 50s, her face lined but kind, her voice carrying the cadence of someone who'd seen both the worst and best of humanity. Jeremiah showed her the photo, his voice steady but laced with hope. "Her name's Loretta," he said. "She'd be about 44 now. I'm her son." Sister Mary studied the photo, her brow furrowing. "I don't know her face," she said, her tone gentle. "But there's a woman who comes sometimes, calls herself Lottie. She don't talk much, but she's got eyes like yours deep, like they carry a story. She'll be here tomorrow for the meal service. You're welcome to come." Jeremiah barely slept that night, his mind racing with possibilities. Was Lottie his mother? Could it be that simple, after all these years? The next day, he arrived at Hope House early, his heart pounding as he helped serve plates of chicken and rice to a line of weary faces. He scanned each one, searching for the woman in the photo, for the eyes Sister Mary had described. When she walked in, he knew. She was thinner than the girl in the picture, her hair streaked with gray, her face etched with the lines of a hard life. But her eyes, those were unmistakable, dark and deep, carrying a sorrow that mirrored his own. She moved slowly, her hands trembling as she took a plate, her gaze fixed on the floor. Jeremiah's breath caught, and for a moment, he couldn't move. "Sister Mary," he whispered, pulling her aside. "That's her, ain't it, Lottie?" Sister Mary nodded, her hand resting on his arm. "Go slow, Jeremiah. She's fragile, been through more than most. But if she's your mama, she deserves to know you." He approached her table, his heart a drumbeat in his chest. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice soft but steady. "Can I sit with you?" She looked up, her eyes meeting his, and for a moment, time stopped. There was a flicker of recognition, a spark that crossed the years between them. "Who you?" she asked, her voice rough but curious. "My name's Jeremiah," he said, sitting across from her. I think you might be my mother." The words hung in the air, heavy and fragile, like glass about to shatter. Lottie's eyes widened, her hand trembling as it reached for the table's edge. "Jeremiah," she whispered, her voice breaking. "My baby." Tears spilled down her cheeks, and Jeremiah felt his own eyes burn. He didn't know what he'd expected anger maybe, or denial, but not this raw, unguarded grief. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers, and for the first time in his life, he felt the weight of his mother's touch, fragile but real. They talked for hours, the shelter emptying around them. Lottie told him her story, her voice halting but honest. She spoke of the pain that had driven her to gin, the shame that had kept her from coming back, the years spent drifting through shelters and streets, trying to outrun her own heart. "I loved you," she said, her eyes never leaving his, "but I wasn't strong enough to keep you." "I'm so sorry, Jeremiah." He listened, his heart breaking and mending with every word. He didn't forgive her, not yet, but he understood. And in that understanding, he found a piece of himself he'd been searching for, a peace that let him see his mother not as a ghost, but as a woman who'd fought her own battles and lost. As he walked home that night, the city lights blurring through his tears, Jeremiah felt a shift inside him. The search wasn't over, but it had changed. He wasn't just looking for Loretta anymore. He was looking for a way to heal, for both of them. And in that moment, he knew his purpose was bigger than his pain, a fire that would carry him into the future. The bridge between the Chicago winter of 1994 wrapped the city in a blanket of gray, the cold seeping into bones and buildings alike. Jeremiah, now 22, felt the chill as he walked the familiar streets of Englewood, his breath visible in the air. His meeting with Lotte, his mother, had left him raw, his heart a tangle of hope and hurt. He carried her story like a stone in his chest, heavy but precious, a piece of his past he could finally touch. Yet the reunion wasn't the end he'd imagined. It was a beginning, fragile and uncertain, demanding a courage he hadn't known he'd need. Lottie stayed at Hope House, her presence a quiet constant in the shelter's rhythm of meals and murmured prayers. Jeremiah visited her every week, bringing small gifts, a scarf to keep her warm, a book of poetry he'd loved at Morehouse, a thermos of Clara's homemade soup. Each visit was a step toward understanding, though the path was uneven. Lottie's eyes, so like his own, held a flicker of pride when she looked at him, but also a shadow of shame that made her words halting. "You're a good man, Jeremiah," she'd say, her voice soft. "Better than I ever deserved." He didn't argue, though the words stung. Instead, he listened, letting her stories fill the gaps in his own. She spoke of her childhood in Mississippi, of a mother who worked 3 jobs and a father who drank himself into silence. She told him of the dreams she'd had singing in a church choir, owning a little beauty shop, dreams that crumbled under the weight of poverty, and a man who promised love but left her broken. Jeremiah heard the pain in her voice, the regret that clung to every word. And he began to see her not as the mother who'd left him, but as a woman who'd been fighting her own battles long before he was born. At the community center, Jeremiah's work took on new urgency. The kids he mentored, boys and girls with eyes full of questions, reminded him of himself, of Lottie, of the countless others who'd been caught in the city's undertow. He started a program called Roots and Wings, a space where young people could share their stories and dream of futures they could build. He brought in guest speakers, teachers who'd risen from the same streets, their words proof that resilience could outlast despair. The kids listened, their faces alight with possibility, and Jeremiah felt his purpose solidify, a bridge between his past and their futures. But the bridge wasn't just for the kids. It was for him and Lottie, too. One Sunday, he invited her to Reverend Thomas's church, a place she'd avoided since her own childhood. She hesitated, her hands twisting in her lap, but Jeremiah's quiet insistence won her over. "Just come, Mama," he said, the words slipping out naturally for the first time. Her eyes glistened, and she nodded, pulling her scarf tighter around her shoulders. The church was warm, filled with the familiar hum of gospel hymns and the rustle of Sunday dresses. Reverend Thomas preached about forgiveness, his voice rising and falling like a tide, and Jeremiah felt Lottie's hand tremble in his. Clara, sitting on his other side, squeezed his arm, her eyes soft with understanding. After the service, the congregation embraced Lottie, their welcomes genuine but gentle, sensing the fragility of her return. Miss Evelyn, older now but still fierce, pulled her into a hug, whispering, "You did right, Kuman Batgirl. He's your miracle." That moment marked a shift. Lottie started attending the church regularly, her presence tentative at first, but growing steadier with each week. She found a job at a local diner, washing dishes in the back, her hands steadying with purpose. Jeremiah helped her move into a small room at Hope House, a step towards stability. And though their conversations were still laced with pain, they began to weave a fragile trust. "I ain't never gonna be the mama you deserved," she told him one evening, her voice thick. "But I'm here now, Jeremiah. I'm trying." He nodded, his throat tight. "That's enough," he said, and meant it. Forgiveness wasn't a single act, but a process, one he was learning to navigate with every shared meal, every quiet moment they spent together. He saw her strength, the resilience that had kept her alive through years of hardship, and it mirrored his own. They were two survivors, bound by blood and the will to keep going. But the world outside their fragile bond was far from kind. The community center faced funding cuts, a blow that threatened to shut down Roots and Wings. Jeremiah fought for it, writing grants and rallying the community, his voice carrying the same fire he'd found at a city council meeting. He stood before a room of tired bureaucrats, his words sharp and unyielding. "These kids ain't just numbers on your budget," he said, his eyes sweeping the room. "They're futures you're choosing to invest in or throw away. I was one of them, and somebody chose me. Now it's your turn to choose." The room was silent, then erupted in applause from the community members who'd come to support him. The council approved partial funding, enough to keep the program alive, and Jeremiah felt a surge of pride mixed with exhaustion. He was making a difference, but the weight of it was heavy, a reminder that resilience demanded sacrifice. One night, as he sat with Lottie at the diner, sharing a slice of pie after her shift, she reached for his hand. "I'm proud of you," she said, her voice steady for the first time in months. "I don't know how you turned out so strong, but you did. You're my reason to keep going." Jeremiah's eyes burned, and he squeezed her hand, the words settling into his heart. He saw her now, not as the woman who'd left him, but as the one who was fighting to stay. And in that moment, he knew their story wasn't finished. The bridge they were building, between past and present, pain and healing, was stronger than he'd dared to hope. As winter gave way to spring, Jeremiah felt the fire within him burn brighter, fueled by the love of his family, Clara, Reverend Thomas, Letty, and the kids who looked to him for hope. He was no longer just the boy from the Robert Taylor homes, but a man forging a path for others, his resilience a light in the darkness. The legacy forged spring in Chicago, 1995, brought a cautious warmth to the city, as if the sun itself was testing the waters after a long, brutal winter. Jeremiah, now 23, stood at the threshold of a life he'd never imagined as a boy in the Robert Taylor homes. The community center in Englewood buzzed with activity, the Roots and Wings program thriving despite the constant threat of budget cuts. Kids filled the rooms with laughter and questions, their voices a reminder of why Jeremiah kept fighting. Lottie's transformation was slow but steady, like a river carving a new path through stone. She'd moved from washing dishes to waiting tables at the diner, her smile growing brighter with each paycheck. She'd started singing again, her voice a soft echo of the dreams she'd once held. Joining the church choir at Reverend Thomas's urging. Jeremiah sat in the pews each Sunday, his heart swelling as her notes rose above the others, a testament to her resilience. She wasn't the mother he'd once longed for, but she was something more real, a woman reclaiming her life, one day at a time. Their relationship wasn't without its struggles. There were days when Lottie's guilt resurfaced, her eyes clouding with memories of the years she'd lost. Jeremiah felt the weight of those moments, the questions that lingered despite their growing bond. "Why didn't you come back sooner?" he asked her one evening, the words slipping out as they sat on the steps of Hope House, the city humming around them. Lottie's hands twisted in her lap, her gaze fixed on the cracked pavement. "I was scared," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Scared I'd hurt you again. Scared you'd hate me. I thought you were better off without me." She looked at him then, her eyes glistening. "I was wrong, Jeremiah, but I'm here now, and I ain't leaving." He nodded, his throat tight. The pain of her absence would never fully fade, but her presence was a gift he hadn't expected. He reached for her hand, and they sat in silence, the weight of their shared history a bridge they were still crossing together. At the community center, Jeremiah's work was gaining attention. A local newspaper ran a story on Roots and Wings, calling it a beacon of hope in England. The article quoted one of the kids, a 14-year-old girl named Tasha, who said, "Mr. J makes us feel like we can do anything." Jeremiah read the words with a mix of pride and humility, knowing the real heroes were the kids themselves, their resilience a mirror of his own. But success brought new challenges. A developer eyed the community center's building for a new commercial project, threatening to displace the program. Jeremiah rallied the community, organizing protests and petitions, his voice carrying the same fire he'd found at a packed town hall meeting. He stood before a crowd of neighbors, parents, and kids, his words cutting through the tension. "This ain't just a building," he said, his eyes sweeping the room. "It's a home for our kids, a place where they learn they're enough. You take that away, you're taking away their future." The crowd roared, and Tasha, standing in the back, held up a sign that read, "Save Roots and Wings." The image made the evening news, and the pressure forced the developer to back off. The victory was sweet, but Jeremiah knew it was only a battle won, not the war. The system was still stacked against places like Englewood, and he felt the weight of that truth every day. One evening, as he walked home from the center, he passed the site where the Robert Taylor homes had once stood. The buildings were gone now, demolished in a city pushed for renewal, but the ghosts remained. He stood there, the wind carrying the echo of his childhood, and felt a surge of clarity. His life, his pain, his triumphs, his resilience was a story he could share, not just with the kids at the center, but with the world. He began writing, late at night in his apartment, his pen moving across the pages with a urgency he couldn't contain. He wrote about the crib where he'd once lain, neglected but not forgotten, about Miss Evelyn's courage, Clara's love, Reverend Thomas's faith, and Lottie's redemption. He wrote about the streets that had tried to claim him, and the fire that had kept him whole. The words poured out, raw and real, a testament to a life forged in adversity. Jeremiah's eyes burned as he hugged her, his heart full. He looked at Lottie, standing beside Clara, her face glowing with pride, and he knew this moment was theirs, too. "This ain't just my story," he told the crowd, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "It's all of ours. Every one of us who kept going, who found a way to rise." The book found its way into schools, churches, and community centers across Chicago, then beyond. It wasn't a bestseller, but it touched lives, sparking conversations about neglect, resilience, and the power of community. Jeremiah used the proceeds to expand Roots and Wings, opening a second location on the west side. Lottie became a mentor there, sharing her story with kids who needed to know they weren't alone. Years later, as Jeremiah stood at the podium of a national conference on youth empowerment, his name now known in circles far beyond Chicago, he spoke of the boy he'd been, the mother he'd found, and the family that had lifted him. Resilience ain't just surviving, he said, his voice carrying the weight of his journey. It's choosing to build something beautiful from the broken pieces. In the audience, Lottie sat beside Clara and Reverend Thomas, her hands clasped tightly, tears streaming down her face. She saw her son, the baby she'd once left behind, now a man who'd turned pain into purpose. And in that moment, she knew her own resilience had found its echo in him, a legacy that would outlast them both. Jeremiah's story wasn't the end, but a beginning, a testament to the surprising outcome of a neglected black baby. A life forged in the crucible of adversity, shining with the unbreakable light of resilience.